Welcome to Podcapers, the official podcast of A Place to Hang Your Cape. And this week, we're actually going to talk about something really, really serious. Cue the music. Hello there, Capers, and as I said, welcome to Podcapers, the official podcast of A Place to Hang Your Cape. My name's Scott James Merridew, and this is the show where we talk about various geek and nerd-related topics, and are joined each week by a very special different guest. That is still the case. We're still going to talk about geeky, nerdy stuff, but we're going to do it within the context of talking about a serious issue. You know what we're talking about. You've seen the title of the podcast episode, and what we're going to be talking about is Black superheroes, and of course, the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm joined this week by a guy who's been on the show a few times before. I've had the honour of working with him many more times beyond that. Give it up, Keepers, for Archit Tripathi.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on. I'm so glad I got a chance to do this with you. I said in the previous episode that we were going to talk about this, because this is worth talking about.
Yes, definitely. It's one of the defining issues of our time, and sadly has been an issue of our times for way, way too long now. So hopefully this time around we get some resolution on it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's, I think, what everyone who is supporting the Black Lives Matter movement is hoping for: actual resolution, not just a little bit of reform, not just, okay, promises, we're going to sort it out, some actual goddamn resolution, because it has been time and a half since any kind of reasonably reality-based expiry date for a fix, let's be honest, a fix for the systemic racism and bigotry that is prevalent in both American society and UK society. We are long past that. I think before either of us were even born.
Mm-hmm.
We're overdue. We're overdue.
These struggles are not at all new. They've been going on for, really for hundreds of years now. And there's always moments like we're in right now, where there's some upheaval and some unrest. But generally speaking, historically, out of those moments comes great, meaningful change. And it's still been incremental though, and so hopefully this time around, with the kind of awareness that there is, also thanks to the internet and the global awareness that's helped with, hopefully this time around it's going to be a little bit less incremental and be more of a monumental step towards progress.
Because for all the steps and bravery and momentum generated in the 1960s by the civil rights movement with Martin Luther King, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have the tools we have, and it's important that we use them. And that's why I'm doing this. That's why we're doing this, because as I said in previous episode, I have a platform. It's a small one, but I want to use it to, I was going to say spread a message, but that's incredibly pretentious. You don't need me, Capers, to spread this message. You're aware of this, and you don't need another white person telling you how it is and what people need to do. But to stay silent is worse than doing something negative, I think. It's just as bad as doing something negative. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about something, and we're going to use this show in a positive way to spread awareness, if we can, to give you Capers some links and some helpful avenues to which you can direct support towards the Black Lives Matter movement. And also, we're just going to talk about something that I've talked about before, the capital letter R word, representation. Because representation, or rather a lack of representation, in our media, in our TV shows, in our movies, in our comic books, even in our prose books, is a symptom of the systemic racism problem in our societies. It's one small, tiny head of the massive, multi-headed hydra that is bigotry. And honestly, we could do a whole episode on talking just about that and the lack thereof. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk about both of our top 10 uh, black superheroes, be they African American or African or even from other parts of the world, because this is a universal thing. Black people can be found all over the world, and bigotry and racism, sadly, are also all over the world. This is not just limited to America or the UK. This is a human problem. It's a human problem, and it's the worst kind of human problem. We're not treating one group of humans the same as another group of humans, and this is often represented, sometimes very well, sometimes not so well, in the pages of superhero comics. So, I mean, you read comics when you were a kid, right, Archit?
Yes, of course. Like
And
any
so
good nerd, I've definitely grown up on a steady diet of superheroes and inspirational figures that inspire us to fight the injustices that we see around us. So which is another thing that I just find funny sometimes when people are so surprised by young people coming out in such force about these issues. What did you expect? This is every story you've ever told us growing up is to fight against injustice. So when we see it, what do you think we're going to do?
from Game of Thrones to Star Trek to Star Wars to Spider Man, that's the story that is most often told. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But what I wanted to ask is, if it's not too personal a question, when was the first time in a comic book, doesn't have to be a superhero comic book, you saw someone on the page that looked like you?
Well, for me, actually, I guess I was sort of lucky in the sense that in India they do have some, domestic comic brands and superheroes and stuff. I don't fully remember super well some of them, but I think there was a guy called Naga Man or something. He was like a snake guy and stuff. So there was a little bit of that, but even within those depictions, I remember as a kid, like if I really was to go back and find those comics today and look at the way that that hero was depicted, they're actually possibly as a result of colonialism, they're actually still kind of whitewashed in their appearance. So I think for me, really, probably the first meaningful time. Um, Man, I don't. I mean, honestly, being Indian, I don't think there really are that many Indian superheroes even now. So
I
I'm
mean,
not
if I racked my brains, I could think of one or two examples, but that's part of the problem because I don't have to rack my brains to think of a white superhero, and this is the point I was getting at because I also don't remember the first time I saw someone who looked like me in a comic book because there were just so many.
right.
Uh,
Exactly. So I mean, for me, I think the first time that I saw someone who at least was non-white in comic books probably came about. Oh, that's my wife coming home and our puppy barking. Um, but yeah, so I think the first time that I actually witnessed somebody who at least was non-white that I could latch onto was probably Falcon from Captain America, who was Captain America's longtime collaborator, sidekick, if you want to call it that. One time, and I
he
think
was his sidekick he was officially dubbed his sidekick for a long time, and since then he's grown to be his partner, and then beyond that to a superhero in his own right.
exactly.
And
So I think that was probably the first time where I was like, oh, okay, so people of other shades can also display heroism and have those admirable qualities to them. It's not restricted. And as a kid, you don't necessarily think of it in such explicit terms, but it does kind of sink in where you're like, well, I definitely don't look like these people. And I do look a little bit more like this guy at least.
but it's all subconscious.
Yeah, it kind of works on multiple levels. I mean, it's definitely one of those things that, as a kid, it's just you find yourself gravitating to certain characters because of those things, and maybe at that time, in your development, you don't necessarily understand why you gravitated to them, but then looking back, it becomes obvious that it's like, oh, well, I see why.
Hmm. And I can't point to a point like that where I had the reverse or something like else happened to me because of my privilege. And that's the weird thing. As a kid, you're not aware of your privilege when you're a white kid. Here's the thing: I grew up in a lot of different places in the UK. Almost all of those places, I was surrounded by mostly white people, and that's was nothing intentional on behalf of my parents. My dad was in the Air Force, so you go where you're told, and that was just what happened. But it wasn't until when I was in secondary school, high school for you guys, and I saw I interacted and was friends with and knew people who were not white. But it wasn't until I was 18 and actually left uh, the Cotswolds, like rural Oxfordshire, where I stayed from age 11 till 18, and went to Southampton, which is a metropolitan city, where I actually got immersed in other people of, on a deep level of people of different ethnicities, different cultures. And it wasn't really a culture shock for me, but it's just like, okay, so yeah, I've been pretty sheltered. I've been privileged. But because I grew up reading a lot of those comics, I don't want to say it eased the blow for me because it's a horrible way of putting it. Again, white privilege. I'm trying to think of the right sort of language to use, but it's one of those things where if I just had seen a more representation on the page, maybe that bubble would have been burst earlier or something.
Yes,
I don't know.
very much
And
so, because I think you hit on a really, really important point, which is that, part of the reason that racism works, and one of the ways in which it works, is to dehumanize people and to like prevent you from seeing the humanity within others. And that's why experiences like traveling to other places, meeting people of other cultures, lets you see the humanity within other people, and you realize, oh, you're literally just like me. You love good food, you love beer, you like hanging out with your friends, you like, you just want a decent life. We have all these things in common with each other. And so it's the same thing with representation in the media, where if you aren't able to necessarily travel, you can still, books are a way to travel while staying where you are. So you can still see the humanity of other people and experience that. And that is such a powerful thing towards helping to mitigate or lessen the effects of the racism that surrounds us every day in so many ways.
yeah, and exactly, you're absolutely right. And thankfully, I did have one or two when I was growing up, uh, non-white superheroes that I enjoyed. One of which was Blade, arguably one of the. Because here's the thing: it's you got to be careful of the words used to describe uh, black people, but some words are just appropriate. Blade was cool.
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't think any black person's gonna have an issue with you saying that Blade was cool, because
Nah, because
Blade was
it's
just objectively, he was a badass. I mean, he was super cool. The Wesley Snipes movies came out, and when we were kids, and those were, you know kind of cheesy, but like still really good at the same time. And he was pretty good as Blade, and I'm really looking forward to actually the Mahershala Ali version of it that's going to be coming up soon.
I'm looking forward to that too. But here's the thing: I wasn't allowed to watch the Blade movies when I was a kid. I don't know. My parents would not stand for that. I wasn't even allowed to see the X-Men movie until because I was 8 years old when that movie came out. So I was 6 years old when the first Blade movie came out. So it was a long while before I was allowed to watch those. But I was allowed to read the comics because of my parents. Let's be honest, boomer generation mind. Comics are all okay. Some movies aren't. So that's how I got to see an awesome vampire hunter. And because I was so young when I was reading them, it didn't really trigger my mind. Okay, this guy looks different from me, but I already differentiated himself from myself in my mind because at the age I was 8 years old, 10 years old, I was not a vampire hunter. Shock, I know, but so but it was so cool just to see this guy do what he did and be so effortless and badass doing it. And we needed a character like that at the time because he paid, especially in terms of those movies, because now as an adult looking back at those movies paved the way for other superhero movies. And that's weird when you think that it was a black superhero that paved the way for white superheroes and not the other way around.
Yeah, that is a very interesting thing, and I almost wonder if maybe there's kind of an element of like commercial risk to that, because in general, when it comes to studios and stuff, they always see projects that revolve around ethnicity and around a strong black protagonist or something like that as being somehow an inherent risk, even though like the white properties are rebooted indefinitely. And
Yeah,
so
and that's part of a whole thing I've noticed a lot with Hollywood and stuff. And it's the sad thing is, it's not just black people; it's a whole non-white, non-male, non-cisgendered, non-straight, general bigotry. You can put specific examples for all of those groups, but I
Exactly.
mean,
Yeah. I mean, Wonder
it's
Woman,
what I,
Black
it's what
Panther, all of those were seen as risks until they panned out, and then finally studios were like, "Oh, we can make movies like this."
it's part of what I like to call the feedback loop of bigotry. Oh, we can't do a story with X character because that sort of thing isn't popular because that always bombs. Oh, but you really ought to do it. Okay, well we'll do it, but then we'll put absolutely zero resource into it. It won't work out, and then we'll use that to justify the next project that we'll pass on, and on and on. And that works both behind the scenes as well as in front of the camera because that's how they justify not hiring female directors. And the list goes on. Oh, you're not experienced enough. Well, if you give me a movie, I'll be experienced enough. But it's that sort of bullshit. And so, were there any characters that you wanted to talk about that sort of broke free of that feedback loop of intolerance?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the the feedback loop. Wow, that's deep. I
Well,
gotta think
okay, maybe
about
that's a bit
that.
that's a bit too niche of a question, but I mean, so what's your next character? Is what I was trying to segue to.
Well, I mean, I'm going in no particular order, I guess, but I think maybe to kind of go off of what you were talking about, I think the Miles Morales Spider-Man might
Oh yeah.
be a character that's
Oh, we're getting
really
a standalone game with him.
that yeah, and I mean that's super exciting too. He's going to be getting a standalone game. He just recently had the standalone movie with Into the Spider-Verse, which was really really good. The comics have obviously he's resonated very well with comic book readers
Hmm.
and has now actually been incorporated into just the mainstream Marvel universe
But this is
beyond
here's
the little
here's
side universe they made. So, he's
here's the thing.
obviously a very popular character.
He is, but here's the problem I have with that though. He is a great character. He's a popular character. But here's the thing: when we think of Peter Parker, we think of Peter Parker, but we also think of Spider-Man. When we think of Miles Morales, we think of Miles Morales, but we think of Spider-Man. And here's the problem. It was fine because he was originally introduced as a replacement for a deceased Peter Parker. He was the next Spider-Man, and that worked. Then he got incorporated into the mainstream Marvel universe, but he's still called Spider-Man. And that worked in the movie Into the Spider-Verse because, again, replacement for Peter Parker. That worked. But in the mainstream Marvel universe, he's known exclusively as Miles Morales, and when he's in his costume as Spider-Man, even though there's already another active Spider-Man. And this is the problem, I think. He needs to have his own distinct identity, as divorced as he can be. I know that's a limited sort of avenue for him from Spider-Man. I want him to have his own name, not Spider-Boy or anything. Like, off the top of my head, Spider-Bite or something. I don't know, just because he's got his own unique powers, he's got his own unique character, personality, backstory. He's his own person. He's not just uh, a black version of Peter Parker. He's Miles Morales. You'd never confuse the two. You wouldn't even confuse the costumes, even though they're just sort of slightly different colors. But I just think that he deserves his own identity as a superhero.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I can take it both ways, I guess, on that one. Is I do agree with your point that he has a very distinct identity of his own, and that he could very easily be crafted into a different offshoot kind of identity that's entirely his. But there was also a great moment when they did integrate him into the mainstream Marvel universe, where the current Peter Parker, who is he's like 28 or whatever he is in the
Yeah,
continuity.
he's about 27, 28 according to canon sliding
Right, and
chronology.
so he swings by, I think, an arrest that Miles has made, and they're like, "Who's this guy?" And he's like, "That's Spider-Man." So it's just, I personally loved that moment because it was like Peter Parker was saying, "Yeah, he's just as much Spider-Man as I am.
Well,
He
that's a good
deserves this
perspective on
mantle
that.
just as much as I do, and has earned it, and has every bit of his own level of thing to it."
I mean, it's just I only bring that point up just because I'm a nitpicky bastard who wants things his own way. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the things Miles Morales has done for representation, because it's all very well introducing a new character who happens to be a person of color. People, and when I say people, I mean assholes, get really angry when you introduce a new character that's like a legacy character that's like the same name as an already established white hero. And just sort of jumping off of that, I want to talk about, because there was a point in DC Comics where actually that was happening quite a lot. A lot of characters were getting killed off and being replaced by younger characters, one of which was Green Arrow. And he was replaced by his estranged son that he didn't. Yeah, his estranged son that he didn't know about, called Connor Hawke, who is biracial. In fact, he is officially he's of mixed Asian, African, and European heritage. His mum is half black, half Korean, and his dad, Oliver Queen, Green Arrow, is white. And this is the reason why I wanted to bring this up. A, because he's a legacy character. B, because the Black Lives Matter has not, as far as I'm aware, done this large scale. But a lot of people who claim to support Black Lives Matter, I mean, haven't meant all black people. Well, not all of it. Some people have been very exclusionary when it comes to LGBTQI plus people, like gay black people, trans black people, black women also, or sometimes black men, or just not really bringing up the effect this has and the murders of black children. And obviously, these people are in the minority. This is not, this is not corrupted like the Black Lives Matter movement as it stands. But it's important to bring up the fact that bigotry and racism and Black Lives Matter is for biracial people. Even though they may not be 100% black in terms of their heritage, that does not, and again, white privilege, don't know what I'm talking about, just trying to help. That does not mean that they're automatically not part of that community. Obviously, that's for every single biracial person to decide for themselves. If you want a good example of that, I say good example. An example of that, there's this TV series out called Mixed-ish. Don't know if you've seen that. I've seen a few episodes. I think it's okay. I don't
I've
know.
seen the
Again,
Blackish. Yeah, I've seen the other offshoot shows of that, but I haven't seen that specific one yet.
it's about the main character, Raybo Johnson, growing up in
Right.
the 1980s
Yeah,
as
yes.
a
And I
biracial
mean, it's yeah.
person in a. So I think it's important to bring that up because he took up the mantle. Connor Hawke took up the mantle of Green Arrow for a good long while. Obviously, DC reboots their universe more times than I've had hot dinners, but so that's not the case anymore. But for a while, he was Green Arrow, and he was pretty damn good at it. He, much like his father, his predecessor before him, he had a very close attachment to the Green Lantern legacy character, who at the time was Carl Rayner, who is my favorite Green Lantern. Sorry, John Stewart, we'll get to talking about you in a bit, but Carl just edges it out for me. But and it was interesting because he sort of brought this I want to say Zen-like quality because he like grew up. I think it was like a monastery or something. So it was very much just like, oh no, this isn't just like Oliver Queen, but now he's biracial, like we mentioned before. No, he was again his own unique person. He did things his own unique way. And he did have a lot of time to get to know his father before he got blown up. Literally, got his arm trapped between a wall and a bomb or something on a plane or some shit. Got blown up, and he had time to have like a couple of conversations beforehand. And so it was interesting to see that. I didn't read a lot of those comics, but I thought it was a very interesting take on it, and I think it's one of those things that worked quite well from my perspective, at least.
Yeah, definitely. That's not a character, unfortunately, that I'm super familiar with, so I can't comment too much on that. But I mean, just in terms of the general, what he represents in terms of biracial identity, that's another thing that's so important. Which is also, with Miles Morales is another thing because he's Afro Latin.
Hmm.
He's black, and he's also his mom, I believe, is Puerto Rican. So there's a wide range of Afro Caribbean black people out there, and there's plenty of other types of black people who are biracial, whether it's Asian, whether it's just white and black, or in the case of Blade, let's say for instance, where he's kind of half black, half white, and he's also half human, half vampire, which was definitely not an accident that they made that character that way, and having to walk between two worlds and the difficulties that sometimes arise from that.
Yeah, but this brings up an interesting question. Where do we draw the line in terms of, especially in children's media, using racism as a metaphor, or just explicitly saying about real life racism? Because a lot of times they do it through the guise of, oh, this one group of cartoon ants doesn't like this other group of cartoon ants, and that's bad, kids. And sometimes they just say, oh, there's racism. Some people hate black people for no good reason, not that there ever could be a good reason. And this is a real thing, kids. Better get used to it. And so where do you draw the line with that sort of thing?
I think a lot of it, in my opinion at least, however flawed it may be, is that I think a lot of it kind of comes down to the maturity of your targeted audience. And so I
Mm.
think, if you're just trying to introduce the general concepts of discrimination to very young audiences, then I think, it's kind of that cartoony thing of, oh, these bugs don't like those bugs. That can definitely work out to kind of help open up those conversations at least, and start those concepts kind of trickling through and beginning the understanding of that. And then as you go forward, I think it's okay to deal with it, especially when you're doing with young adult audiences and actual adult audiences. I think you absolutely should tackle it head on because it exists. It's out there. And for the people
And
who
children
experience
will
it, they
experience
don't have
it.
the people who experience it don't have a choice. They experience it head on.
Mm.
So we should, in our conversations about it, also be very direct and head on because let's be honest, going about it the polite way has not really worked out for a long time, has it?
No, absolutely. So, could you, on your list of superheroes, your top 10 ones, can you point to one that has dealt with it head on?
Well, yeah, actually, you just mentioned him a little while ago. Is John Stewart? I would say is definitely
Ah,
somebody who's dealt with racism head on because just the origin story of how we got to meet John Stewart in the old Green Lantern comics. He's Hal Jordan's backup, and the first
oh,
time Hal Jordan.
it's not, it's kind of cringely written.
Yeah, exactly. It's I mean it was a different time, so I'm gonna try to give the writers a little bit of slack, but
Yeah.
it is kind of very cringily written because the first time Hal sees John Stewart, John is having an argument with a police officer who is probably being racist, and Hal is just immediately like, "I don't like this guy's attitude. He's not fit to be a Green Lantern." But the I forgive me, I forget the name of the like celestial beings who govern all of that.
The Guardians of Oa?
Right. So I think one of the guardians that's with him says, "We're not interested in your petty bigotries. John Stewart's the guy. So he's going to be your backup. Go introduce yourself." And so they do that. They introduce themselves. He gets his costume and everything, and then they're literally they have to be assigned to protect this senator who is just an absolute racist piece of. I'll let you fill that in. And
Shit.
oh, okay, I didn't know what the language restrictions on this
You
were.
know what? If we can talk about all the horrible things that's going on right now, the insane racism bigotry, we can say the word fuck if we want.
Okay, cool. So yeah, he's an absolute fucking piece of shit. He is like just a racist piece of shit. He wants to completely eliminate black people's rights. He sees them as being subhuman. He says, "Oh, they have smaller brains. They're way less intelligent. That's why they're all criminals." Blah 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 blah. And he is literally just saying all this in a speech. And yeah, obviously that's enraging Jon Stewart, who's been assigned to protect this guy. And Hal is like, "Well, listen, yeah, he's talking a lot of bullshit. I don't agree with any of it, but that's his right for free speech." Okay, way to be a race apologist, Hal. That's real good of you, man. Real cool.
Like, I
So
know
like,
he's literally calling you subhuman, but
yeah,
he is
like,
allowed to do that.
oh, he's allowed to do that. Yeah, he is, but it's still shitty, and you can like it was just yeah. So Hal is in this story. Hal is an apologist at best, and just as big of a racist piece of shit at worst. And
Fuck Hal Jordan in general. Beyond
yeah,
this example, I hate Hal
not
Jordan. That's why I like
not a
Kyle
huge
Rayner and Jon
fan.
Stewart more.
And Hal Jordan's Green Lantern movie ruined any possible sequels that might have had Jon Stewart in them. So that's another one where it's like, fuck you, Hal.
But
Um,
Jon Stewart went from strength to strength, eclipsing Hal Jordan. Let's be honest, when people think of Green Lantern, some may think of Hal Jordan, but I wager, thanks in no small part due to the Justice League and Justice League Unlimited cartoon series,
Yes,
most people
that was
think
my
of Jon
introduction to Green
Stewart.
Lantern. Yeah, that was the first Green Lantern that I had ever seen was Jon Stewart in those exact cartoons, and he was such a badass. I mean, his whole style of wielding the ring and the kind of like the elaborate constructs that he makes with it's just everything the way he does it is just so awesome. Like it's just so admirable and awesome, and he was just an amazing Green Lantern in my opinion. So
And
yeah,
in
he
the
faced that
in
head on for sure, like from day one.
absolutely, and in the cartoon, he was voiced by Phil Lamar, who is one of my favorite voice actors of all time. But Phil Lamar also did another black superhero, Static.
Yes, static shock. You mean or
Well,
what?
he's called Static, but the TV show you're thinking of is Static Shock, based on the comics. Because here's the thing, Static, along with a couple of other characters, was originally created by Milestone Comics, by the founders of Milestone Comics, Dwayne McDuffie, Dennis Cowan, and uh, Michael Davis, one other guy, can't remember his name. I'll look it up right here. Derek T. Dingle. And he first appeared in a comic called Static, and later on there would be a TV show called Static Shock. But it was great about, first of all, what's great about Static is his real name, Virgil Ovid Hawkins. That's just a great name, just period. But also, it's great because he was, even though he wasn't necessarily the first, he was a young teenage black hero who was just a great person. He tried to do his very best and live up to the responsibility that his electromagnetic powers gave him, and he lived up to that sort of. I mean, he was designed specifically to be sort of like a Spider-Man type guy. And that worked. It worked really well because you don't think of Spider-Man when you think of Virgil, but in terms of personality and sort of like that sort of stuff, you realize, oh, well, kind of. And he's since gone on to, as we say, been in a cartoon series, which was excellent. I haven't seen that many episodes of it, but it is excellent. And of course, other cartoon series since then. But here, I'm just wondering, when are we going to get a Static movie?
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, I think at this point, I really feel like we've proved to Hollywood that these types of projects can definitely work and generate a ton of interest. So,
As long as you put the effort
whether
in.
it's Marvel or it's DC, if you look at it, the properties that have really outperformed, a lot of them have been those quote unquote diversity projects. You know, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Black Panther, which we're definitely going to probably talk about later.
Oh yeah,
And
big
you know,
time.
all of these things definitely have worked. So yeah, let's get with the Static movie, you guys. Let's do this.
Because people of color and just minority groups in general are not little check boxes for you to tick off. Like, okay, we did the black superhero, we did the woman superhero. It's far more than that. And that's what Static really showed. He wasn't I mean, because I haven't read that many of the comics.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether they tackled this head on or not. I'm sure I think they did. I'm pretty sure they did. They definitely did in the cartoon series. But he wasn't defined by his being black. It was addressed, it was an issue sometimes, but that wasn't all he really is. He was
Right.
static. He wasn't the black superhero, wasn't a black superhero. He was static, and he is still static. And he stands on that electromagnetized manhole cover that's zooming about the city uh, proudly, and it's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. So I mean, just out of curiosity, I'm wondering, do you know when Static was created?
Um, I do. I'm not at the top of my head. Hang on, let me check it out.
I mean, just a general time frame, even if it was like
It was
2000s,
the
90s.
it was the was it the 90s? Yeah, it was the 90s. I believe it
Okay,
was
yeah.
the
And that
early
makes sense
90s.
too, because the what you said, which I really love, it, and that's another great point about representation in literature, is the point of that. You know, he's obviously he's black and he's got that identity, but he's not completely just defined by it, and it's not beat to death in every narrative that occurs around him. You know,
But nor is it ignored.
nor is it ignored, exactly. And I mean, it shouldn't be ignored, but it also isn't the defining feature of this person. That he's got lots of other facets to his personality. And I think there was a tendency back in the day with a lot of the earlier black characters that were created to where it did feel like their whole identity just centered around them being black. You know, I mean, the very, very early days of Luke Cage comics, for instance, you know, I
So let's
mean,
talk about Luke Cage then, because I absolutely adore Luke Cage. But
yeah,
then again, I'm more familiar with his modern incarnation. When he
yes,
first started,
his modern incarnation is really great, but back in the day, Luke Cage was created back in 1972. He was the first black superhero to receive his own solo title. The first black superhero was Black Panther. Actually, there was another guy before that. We'll get into that. But Black Panther didn't have his own solo title. So Luke Cage, first solo title, 1972. And you know, his whole story is kind of some slight stereotypes, like, oh, he grew up with a lot of gangs and stuff, which, you know, there's truth to those narratives, but it's also kind of a lazy writing thing where it's like, oh, he's black, he grew up in the ghetto, must have been affiliated with gangs, then he decided to get out of it, then his gang screwed him over, sent him to prison for a crime he didn't commit, which that is something that definitely happens to a lot of black people, of, you know, going
oh,
to being incarcerated for petty crimes or crimes that they never even committed. But you know, there was
there's a
definitely
TV show out right now called For Life, which is I believe, based on a real life story about a black man who was convicted of a crime he didn't commit, given an overly long sentence that would never be given to a white person, but then became like a legal advocate or a lawyer or something, I don't know, in prison, and managed to, after way too long in prison, managed to free himself and work towards proving innocence of people who have been wrongly convicted, especially the black community. And because here's the thing. Here's the thing. I see this as a British person. I see this on the news. I see stories about this on the internet all the time, and it's very easy for me to point at America and say, "Ooh, America, look how racist you are." Ooh, but that's kind of distracting from the fact that here's the thing: my government, my legal system, my justice system, my country is just as racist and just as prejudicial in terms of sentencing. I again, privilege can't talk that much about it. And I mean, generally speaking, British courts, sorry, Archit, ours are slightly better in general, but that doesn't mean we're above the intolerance either. And it's to the point where, and this is the thing, a lot of British people, I think, are just us, if not slightly more so, not that it's competition, just as unaware of the bigotry and intolerance that exists in this country simply because we don't see it. And obviously, there's a huge problem in America, but a lot of people say, because of America, we don't say, oh, I'm sure Britain, yeah, we have a racist past and all that, but things are much better now because of, look at America. We're not like America. But then black British people speak up and say, actually, yeah, no, that's bullshit. That's full of shit. And, God, it's just, it's especially what's happening right now with all the awareness being brought up. So many black celebrities, black actors have spoken up saying, no, I experienced real racism within the British filmmaking or television system. A great example is an actor. Shit, now I can't remember his name.
You're not gonna John Boyega by any chance? I know he's
No,
very
not John.
vocal on these
No.
issues.
Yeah, absolutely, John Bailey. No, it was Noel Clarke. I forgot his last name. I remember his first name. Noel Clarke, who you may remember from Doctor Who, as well as many other things. He's done many great things, like the series called Kidulthood. He's a very prolific, very talented British black actor, and he recently tried to do this series on this channel called Sky over here. What's the name of it again? That what's it called? It's not that. One second. It's called Bulletproof. That's what it is. It's called Bulletproof, and it features both him and another black British actor who's very prolific, Ashley Walters. And he was told straight up to his face with no trace of irony, you'll never get a show with two black lead actors off the ground. He was told that in like 2018. It's people of Britain don't think that this isn't happening. Don't think that this is not a racist country. And here's the thing, as much as you like to point to America and say, ooh, America, here's the thing, and this is something I did not know until a few weeks ago. We have a hand in that because Britain exports tear gas and rubber bullets to America police.
Right. Yeah,
So
which
tear gas.
Yeah, thankfully Scotland just passed that vote, which was really a wonderful
I
show of
saw that.
solidarity.
Yeah, I thankfully Scotland, my other, I guess, home country, because I spent just as much time there in my life as I have down here, and I grew up there partially, and I have ancestry there. Thankfully, Scotland once again has to be the voice of reason in the UK because Wales is too shy to speak up and just say no, this is not okay, and we're going to stop it now. And of course, the English side of things have said fucking nothing. They just put police horses way too close to protesters and try to intimidate protesters over here. Yes, and so yeah, don't think, UK listeners, that the racism doesn't exist, because it does. And if you have to do one thing, be aware of it at least, because
Yeah,
I
that's
wasn't for
where
a
it
long
starts.
time.
That's where it starts. It's being aware of it for sure. And it's a very uncomfortable moment. Don't get me wrong. It's to recognize that kind of ugliness within you. And this is not just, I'm not even going to limit this to just being a solely, purely white phenomenon. It exists within all of us to some degree or other. And confronting it head on and really looking yourself in the mirror and seeing that ugly part of yourself that the world put into you is a very uncomfortable moment. It is very uncomfortable, and it is meant to be uncomfortable. It should
If
be
it wasn't
uncomfortable.
uncomfortable, then that would
Yeah,
be
then you're kind of a
okay, but it's
sociopath,
not.
right? Then there's something really wrong with you. It should be uncomfortable. But face it head on and recognize it, because until you at least see it and really, really see it, you can't do anything about addressing it. So you have to acknowledge that it exists within you, it exists within your grandmother, it exists within your mother, your father, your brothers, your sisters. your best friends, all of their families. Everyone has it to some degree or the other. The
Because it's
reason that we talk
baked into
mostly
our
about white
society
people,
in every level.
yeah, and the reason that we just kind of focus a lot of these dialogues mostly on white people is because white people are the ones who have historically been advantaged and benefited the most from all of that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And because here's the thing, in the US as well as the UK, they are tearing down statues of people, historical people who we know and were confirmed to be blatant, unabashed, unapologetic white supremacists. And here's the thing. Um, Going off the Luke Cage thing, you have to first be aware, and then you have to learn and move on and get some actual progress. Because here's the thing: the writing of Luke Cage started off being all black exploitative and things like that, but he's still going on. And then the Luke Cage I read beyond even the TV show um, was a Luke Cage who was thoughtful, who was proud, who was idealistic, principled, and just had a rock solid conviction. Because here's the thing: when he got invited to be part of the new Avengers after the original Avengers went all kablooey thanks to Scarlet Witch, and Captain America, Steve Rogers, walked up to him and said, "Hey, I want you on the team. I think you're exactly what we need." What do you say to that? And Luke Cage is just like, you know what? Absolutely, because I've got a kid on the way, and I want my little girl to grow up knowing that her dad was an Avenger. But his thing, I've got ideas, I've got suggestions, and I'm gonna want to be heard. And Steve Rogers is like, you will be heard. And we don't see anything coming off of that for a little while until several issues later, when the comic starts with the Avengers, cosmic apocalypse stopping, power hungry, dictator fighting Avengers go to a disenfranchised, impoverished neighborhood where there's a lot of crime, and they go around and they just sort of walk around and talk to people, talk to the residents there, and somewhat intimidate the obvious criminals there, spearheaded by Luke Cage. And a couple of journalists pop up and say, "Hey, Avengers, what are you doing here?" And they're just like, talk to Luke. And Luke says, right, there's this thing that the police do, and I'm not sure how realistic this is. I'm not sure if this happens in real life or how effective it is. Thing the police do where they just sort of hang around neighborhoods and the crime sort of drops off. Then they move on to another neighborhood,
Are you
but the
talking
crimes.
about broken window policing?
No, I don't think that's what they called in the comic. I don't know if that's what it is.
Okay,
But
because
the
there is
point
a
is,
theory of policing which has been widely implemented, definitely in America, since the Reagan years, which is called the broken window policing, which is basically where the theory was that if you focus on stopping all of the really small petty crimes in a neighborhood, it will have an effect on larger crimes. So if you stop small crimes, that helps stop bigger crimes from ever happening in the first place. So the whole broken window thing, where if you see broken windows in a neighborhood, you fix it. Otherwise, over time, the entire neighborhood goes to shit.
and was
And
that effective?
it's not very effective. That's the thing, is that it's really
No.
not. What it's really doing is just finding excuses to incarcerate massive numbers of black bodies, to the point that the United States today has a quarter of the world's
Yeah.
entire prison population, which is a ridiculous statistic based on population
You
sizes.
you have the most people in prison per capita than any other country in the world, and a
Yeah,
vast majority of those people are black.
yep,
That's a
exactly.
scary thought. I
Are
don't think
black
that's
or
what.
brown in some way. So I
Yeah.
think it's like 50, 60% black, and then there's like another 20, 30% that are, Asian and Latino. And so
Mm,
obviously the white portion of that population is a pretty small sliver.
yeah. And I don't think that's what it was based on in the comics. But the point what I'm trying to make is Luke Cage got the Avengers to take a direct, proactive approach into making a neighborhood safer. I don't know how effective that was going to be or how much research the writers did into that, but that was Luke Cage. That was what he wanted to do. He wanted to make just a neighborhood safe for people. That's who he is. And that's really what we needed. And I just want, moving on from that, just going back to the whole learning from things, from and then confronting your privilege. One of the best examples of that through the lens of two black characters. I know we're supposed to be doing like 10 each, but I'm kind of cheating right now and doing two at one time. And that would be Icon and Rocket. Have you heard of those guys? Icon and Rocket are some of the best, in my opinion, again, white privilege, best black characters written in comics, at least at the time. They were in the same universe as Static, the Milestone comics, before they were absorbed into DC. And here's what it is: Icon was a black man who was an alien from outer space, and he was like an alien lawyer. It's a thing. Space has lawyers. And he landed on Earth, got stuck there, and now he lives as among them. And he encounters this girl named Raquel, who later goes by Rocket, and she convinces him to use his powers to become a superhero, and she sort of becomes his sidekick and to sort of help people. And that's interesting in of itself. But what was really interesting about the comic was the conversations they had, because Rocket was very liberal and very, she was young and very aggressive in her beliefs. And Icon was slightly slower, much more older. He was literally like 100-year plus old because, alien. But he was also very conservative. And when I say conservative, I mean actually conservative, not, as we see in the UK and the US, stupid conservative, where you have to demonize and fearmonger and defund and all that shit. And they had these conversations and different perspectives and different ideologies, but it was never about clashing between them. It was never about, oh, you're wrong, oh, you're wrong. They learnt from each other. Sometimes Icon reevaluated his perspective and his philosophies. Like, I never really thought about it. You've opened my eyes, Raquel. And other times she would learn something from him. And it was just this great message about learning, about progress, and about unity. These two people who could not be more different beyond the color of their skin, bearing in mind one of them was an alien, working together to make people's lives better and learning from each other and becoming better people, both of them, in the process. And I just thought, reading it, again, this was in the early 90s, but they're still around, it was just so wonderful to see that.
Right. Just out of curiosity, the character of Icon, like how long do you know like how long has he been living on Earth in the guise of a black person?
I think okay, so according to this, he landed in 1839 in the American South during during slavery, and was adopted by a slave named Miriam, and he's lived on Earth ever since.
Okay. Well, all right. That's definitely I got to check that out because that definitely sounds like a very interesting character. I do have like there's just like a slight part of me that's like, well, if he's just kind of an alien in a suit in a way.
It's not his suit. I think the pod he was in changed his appearance to match what it assumed was human beings look like, so that's why he's black. But so yeah, and so they do, bear in mind, that's why I have to remember the comics, they bring that up. They don't not address that. And he
Right.
still thinks of himself as an alien 100 years later.
Right. Just because for me, like one of the things that for instance, with Martian Manhunter, who is a character that I really love. Don't get me wrong, but there's almost like an element of tokenism with Martian Manhunter, just being like for a long time the only quote unquote black member of the Justice League, even though he's not actually black or and hasn't really had those experiences, and then they kind of brought in Cyborg, who again has just basically had so many aspects of his blackness taken away from him by the writers. Both of those characters. I'm very curious to read Icon to see how they handle that, because with those other two characters, I've always liked them, but I've always felt like they had also problematic aspects to them.
And that's the thing, you see. As great as it is to have representation, we need good representation. We need
Yeah,
accurate, authentic representation.
and
And
that a lot of that comes from hiring writers and people who have those perspectives too, because some of the stuff where that we were talking about earlier, where the identity of the character felt a little bit forced or a little just not a little bit cringy or whatever, or the writing, like Hal meets John, for instance, and the writing there, the cringiness of it. Some of that cringiness is also because for so long these narratives of color were still being told by white people.
And it's not that white people can't tell those stories, it's just that they're not our stories to tell necessarily.
Yeah, and there's just certain parts of the perspective that, as well meaning as someone might be, they're just not going to have had that perspective and that experience, which
Because, I mean,
helps inform a more authentic narrative.
because here's the thing, I'm a writer and I've written characters that aren't white. I've made a great concerted effort to write characters that aren't white because I want to bring that representation. But again, white privilege rears its ugly head. I could write someone that I thought was a great example of representation and not realize how bad of a job I was doing. And that's not necessarily my fault, but it's something I have to be aware of and monitor. And if someone came along who was from that background, be that ethnicity, gender identity, sexuality, whatever, who could tell the story better, I think it would be my responsibility possibly to hand that over to them and let them tell that story.
I love that. Yeah, I mean, at the very least, to listen to what they have to say about it and take that feedback and incorporate it. So the best way to get the most authentic writing for anything is to kind of really immerse yourself within that subject, within that concept as much as you can. So seek out voices of color to just storyboard ideas off of them. And that goes for everybody. And also for major studios and stuff like that, which have gotten so much better over the years. But for a long time, it was still, even with the best intentions, it was still only white voices telling black stories. And so having brought on more black voices and more people of color into these boardrooms, into these writer rooms, has definitely been a huge factor in why we see a lot of these narratives feeling so much more compelling today than they did when they originally came out. The
And
new versions of them are so much better done because of that.
and thankfully, one of the creators, the creator of Icon of Rocket, Dwayne McDuffie, that I mentioned earlier, who has since sadly passed away, he is black. So, I mean, even if you don't like the character, even if you don't think the character is well written, it's a layer of authenticity that it
Yes.
needs.
Yeah, definitely. And again, I mean,
So you
I'm
can still
really
criticize the
curious.
character.
Yeah, and like I said, I'm really curious to read about Icon because from what you described, if he's landing in the deep south in the 1800s and just gets us kind of assigned by his pot or whatever it is to be a black person in that time and has since been living in America ever since then without having read it, I have a feeling that most likely that probably would have still informed his perspectives in a more authentic way.
Mm-hmm. And I'd say going off of Cyborg and Marshall. In fact, just going back to what you're saying about the writing of that, my worry is, yes, these voices should absolutely be telling these stories. My worry is the people in charge, the studio heads, the editors, whoever, will only allow them to tell those stories instead of just any story. And no, you don't just get the black person to just write the story about the black characters. They could write any story. There's so many different stories that people can tell. It is very much a case of just the white people, and that's okay. I don't. Here's the thing: uh, racism against white people is a thing. It's real, and it is 100% a non-issue. It exists, but you know what? If someone was racist towards me for the color of my skin, A, that would be the first time anyone had ever done that. And B, I would not make a big deal out of it because it's not the same. Racism is not okay against anyone, but it's not. It's to compare one instance for me compared to, say, several hundreds of years, if not thousands of years of bigotry and intolerance. It's not the same. So
It
the
isn't, and
rules can't be the same.
exactly, it isn't. And actually, there's an important distinction also that can be made at this point, which is, discrimination exists all over and across all people and all cultures. Discrimination against people who are different, against the outsider, against the other group, always exists. But when I think in the modern context of how we understand the word racism itself is a systemic discrimination that historically is used to give advantages to one group of people very much at the expense of another group of people. So while there's definitely discrimination, there's definitely people of color who have a lot of discriminatory attitudes and prejudices towards white people. Racism itself is more in nowadays is more understood as being a systemic thing. And so it is one of those things where, like, I don't want to say no, people of color can't be racist, because again, especially in other countries, there are absolutely racist systems happening within those countries as well. But it is just an important distinction to make, that that there is a difference between discrimination and prejudice and racism, which is a much huger, much more insidious, much broader system that pervades through all aspects of life.
See, I never considered it that way, and that's a really interesting way of putting it. And because that's the thing, that's the scare. Because it's easy to call out. Well, I say easy. That is not easy, but it's it's one thing to point out to an individual, identify them as a bigot, and call them out on it. It's another thing to alter, take down, or indeed dismantle a system of oppressiveness, a system of discrimination. And because that's what the Black Lives Matter right now is trying to do. They are not just trying to take down individuals within the police or the government. They're trying to make the skeletal framework that allowed those people to hold the positions that they did of authority, and to make the policies that oppressed people to task, and to change it so that those sorts of people can't get a foothold and can't do what they did. They can't murder black people indiscriminately and face little to no consequences for it. They can't pass horrific legislation that devalues people's lives. And that's the thing. See, it's scary. I can only imagine how scary it is to go up against such a behemoth of a thing. But that's what heroes do, funnily enough,
Yeah,
and that's why some.
exactly. You said it best. And I mean, that's, again, going back to where we started, is that's all the stories that we were ever told, is, even if you're one person, go up against that huge, seemingly insurmountable evil, because it is the responsibility of every single person to fight that evil in whatever capacity they can.
Yeah, and it's great because the people who are working so hard now to make people's lives better will inspire future generations to continue that fight, because this is not going to be over in a couple of months. By the end of the year, it's not like, okay, we fixed racism, yay! Like that's not gonna happen. With the best will in the world, it's not gonna happen. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. Let's be honest. If we have a shot at doing that, I say take it. But it's a fight that did not start with us and will not end with us, sadly. But we can inspire others to continue the fight, and that's brings me to the next character I want to bring up, Patriot, a member of the Young Avengers, a character who was inspired by Captain America. And I think there have been different Patriots since then, but I just remember the main one. And that character sort of struck me quite a bit in his rigid determination to live up to the legend of Captain America, the person he was sort of inspired by, and the sort of person he tried to emulate, as it were. And I remember him in the first pages of Young Avengers, really trying to live up that legend, but also in the first couple of issues of the much maligned and deservedly so Civil War comic, where he's one of the first superheroes to experience violence because of the new legislation passed banning people who don't register with the government being superheroes. And I don't think it's a coincidence, or maybe it is a coincidence, and Mark Miller just doesn't really think about this kind of thing, so maybe he does, who knows, that one of the first characters who really experiences negative physical violence and gets pretty hurt because of actions by the so-called authorities was a black kid.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's something that we see happening not just in the pages of comic books all the time, but I mean in the news every day. Is the yeah exactly. I mean, I have a feeling it probably wasn't coincidental. There was probably some deliberation that went into having him be the first person to encounter that.
And it's pretty horrific, actually, when you read the pages. But then that's Mark Miller for you. He's just kind of horrific. I'm not a big fan of his. I mean, he's fine, just like stick to doing Wanted and stuff. Don't bring that shit into the Marvel universe. Don't make Captain America all weird and angry. But yeah, and that's because it's always heartbreaking and it's always tragic when you turn on the news and see that yet another innocent black person, or just a black person in general. They don't have to be innocent. Just because they might not be innocent doesn't immediately strip them of their civil rights not to be murdered by the police. But it's especially heartbreaking when it's a young person or a young child, even. And here's the thing. Again, another aspect of white privilege that again I've been educating myself on recently, and I do that through a lot of that through the media. And one television show I've been watching recently is a show called 911. It's quite popular. And they talk about, because one of the characters is a black female police officer played by Angela Bassett, who is an absolute goddess. She was considered to police, absolute legend, considered to play Storm, actually, in the first X-Men movie, but she had to pass on it.
Oh, God, that would have been... Because one thing I will say, Storm is another character that I absolutely love and who's definitely on this list of amazing black superheroes. But like the Halle Berry version was a little disappointing, right? Like she didn't do a hell of a lot, and
That was
I kind
Halle
of wonder if
Berry.
Angela Bassett would have done more with it.
I mean, who's to say? I think the writing was the real problem. Halle Berry did fine. She did fine, but maybe not the accent or the wig. But that last one was not her fault. But there's in that show 911. Some of the black main characters. One of them who's like the ex-husband of Angela Bassett and their kids. I get pulled over by the police, who are clearly racist and clearly stopping them from because they're black. They're driving while black. Apparently, that's a crime. And the little son of his, gets really scared, and the dad gets really scared because he thinks the police are going to shoot him. And it looks like that might happen at one point. Thankfully, it doesn't. But then later on in the episode, he sits down with the kid and he has what I've come to realize is not a conversation, but the conversation that so many black parents or non-white parents have with their children about what it now means, especially if you're a man, but especially if you're a man, what it means to be a person of color in this society with the police the way they are, and just trying desperately to give them the tools they need to survive. I can't even comprehend that.
And the really fucked up thing is that even after having those conversations and having all those tools to survive and all those rules placed in your head of, oh, don't look at a white lady, don't touch anything that you're not going to actually buy, don't wear a hoodie at night. All these rules, even then, even a kid who follows every one of those to the T can still be shot with impunity.
Yeah, it's
and that's the reality that black parents have to face every day, is that even if their child does everything perfectly, they still might not make it.
My dad never had to have a conversation with me when I was a kid about that. Not once. And I know that's because of the color of my skin. And I know that if my dad was a person of color and I was a person of color, he probably would have had that conversation with me, because my dad is not a dummy. He's a very smart man, and he would have known to do that. And I can't imagine. I can only imagine sitting down with a kid, a young child. The kid is just like, what, 10 years old, even that? And he has to have a conversation about the tools he needs to not get shot by people that are supposed to protect him. People in the same profession as his mother, who is a good police officer and tries her very best, but is part of a system that she knows is systemically racist. And it's heartbreaking. And it's just interesting to get that sort of peek into that world and into that sort of psychology of that kind of society. And then that brings me to another character I want to talk about. It's this guy who's sort of been thrust into this, I don't know, maybe that's the wrong way of saying it, but he's part of this society where he's not 100% accepted. He's accepted by the people around him, but he's not always accepted. And that's War Machine. And I'm not necessarily talking about the movie version, I'm talking about the comics version. Again, I'm not that familiar, but here's the thing. When looking back on it, the first time I read Iron Man, it was when James Rhodes, aka War Machine, was Iron Man. Because he was Iron Man for a time. He eventually handed it back over to Tony Stark. But the very first time I read Iron Man was in the classic crossover series Secret Wars. And I didn't know, I was very young when I read that, so I didn't know that Iron Man was Tony Stark. I knew Iron Man was Iron Man, but I didn't know it was Tony Stark. So the first time I saw Iron Man, it was James Rhodes. And I'll never forget this scene where Iron Man's suit gets a bit damaged during one of the many fights they have in that series, and Reed Richards takes a look at it to try and fix it, and takes off the arm, and of course, James Rhodes is black, so he's got black skin, and he's talking with Reed Richards, and he's saying, I just remember so clearly the line, "I bet you were surprised, or I bet you weren't expecting to see that there was a black man underneath the suit." And Reed Richards sort of like absentmindedly goes, oh, I never gave it much thought. I knew there was a man underneath. And I just, looking back as an adult now, I realize that James Rhodes knew that most people would be surprised that there was a black man underneath. He knew that people would have that gut reaction that there is probably white, that assumption that there would be a white guy underneath. Even though at this point, Iron Man had not revealed his secret identity. No one knew what he looked like underneath the Iron Man suit. But that was probably like the first time he ever got surprised by that. And it's a shame they had to be surprised by that.
Yeah, exactly. Because why not, right? Why can't they be? And there's just so much like, and that's a real thing too. It's not even a made up thing at all of people being surprised by things. So you have where with so many things where they cast a black person in a certain role, for instance, which you know isn't necessarily even like a role that's defined by its ethnicity. So it could be played by absolutely anyone, but the internet just goes off into absolute shit fits. How dare they have a black person do this, or like again, to bring up John Boyega, the whole John Boyega stormtrooper thing, and people are like, what, they can't, so you're cool with all of these like force wielding aliens with tentacle heads, but there can't be a black man in space?
Yeah, and it was because he was a stormtrooper. He said, a black man can't be a stormtrooper. And everyone, just the whole internet went out with a cry of, why?
Yeah,
Why
exactly.
not?
Which I mean, I guess just to play the devil's advocate, I guess I kind of maybe understand that it was the whole clone versus stolen kids thing, and maybe at the time that those images were released, people didn't realize that like the new series was kind of giving a different origin for the stormtroopers that were within that film than the Clone Wars and the classic movies. So maybe there was some of that where people expected more clones, But it's still like, is it really that hard to swallow? Like, is this the hill that you want to die on?
And then John Boyega goes out to the British public and he says, I'm going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about how much this means to me. I don't think I might have a career after this. And I understand why he thinks that. A, because of the systemic racism in Hollywood, but also because the Star Wars, Lucasfilm, Disney, whoever you want to say, did not treat him very well. And he got very disillusioned with all of them. And I can completely understand why. And then he goes out and he gives such, I don't know if you saw the speech, but it's such an impassioned, heartbreaking speech. And to see all these people say, we stand with you, and that's great, that's good. John Boyega needs to be in more things. We need to see him in more things. Maybe it's about him being black, or maybe it's about a character that's black. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just a character that could be played by anyone. And this is the thing, because we've all seen the film Independence Day. You've seen that, right? Right. And Roland Emmerich wanted to cast Will Smith in the role that he eventually played in Independence Day. But the studio like, oh no, you can't cast Will Smith. But Roland Emmerich was just like, why not? I think he'd be a good short fit. And apparently, according to Roland, he experienced a lot of racism from the studio pushing back against, I think, a role that could have been played by anyone.
Yeah, and I mean, are there not black people in our military? Have they not been dying for your country for God knows how many years now?
The same people, same military officers, infantrymen, servicemen, Marines, whoever, who have to serve in military bases named after Confederate people.
Seriously, yeah, exactly. And it's just the shocking kind of like just the disconnected insensitivity of it all. Like how do you not even register that could be a horrible thing?
Because America. America has this weird state of mind, especially in the South, when it comes to states' rights. And this is an alien concept for me, admittedly, because I live in the UK and we have counties, and they have county councils, but they're just like local municipal government, like you would have in a city or something. It's not really. We don't decide what the laws are in Oxfordshire versus Northumberland, for example. The laws are all the same across the country. So it's a very alien concept for me. Maybe I just don't get it. But they talk about pride in the Confederacy because that's their history. It's like, no, like you can acknowledge your history, you can remember your history, but that doesn't mean you should be proud of it. Because it wasn't for states' rights, it was for slavery. The states' rights to own slavery, sure, but very much slavery. It wasn't like we want Southern pride, we want our own way of doing things.
Yeah,
No,
it's
you just
written
wanted to
into
be
the
allowed to
Declarations
own
of
people.
Confederacy. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
all of these things. Like it's literally so many of the states wrote that specifically into their clauses of Confederacy and into their like statements of why they were doing it is because they believed in preserving that system and that way of life that they had gotten used to. And I mean, let's be face it, that free labor that had helped them all become very, very rich.
They argued that it was for economic reasons. Yeah, because you can make a lot of money when you don't pay the people who work for you.
Yeah, shocking.
I know. And then hundreds of years later, to have black military service people staying, living, and working on military bases named after people who would see them in chains, literal chains, is the height of arrogance, ignorance, and, as you say, racism. And it's it goes beyond the whole statue thing, because this is a problem far beyond black people in America. Hello, the Washington Redskins. And Britain has its own problem with that. Don't pretend like we don't. Because we act so superior a lot of the time. Because yes, because we abolished the slave trade and we never allowed slaves to be held on British soil. Yeah, but we basically started the slave trade and we were one of the active participants in it. It wasn't just like having a hand in it. We were the slave trade. We weren't the only people doing it, but we were it. And the British Empire, want to go into colonialism, God, will be here all day. And as a British person, because here's the thing, this was not taught in school, in the schools I went to. I went to many schools, and not once was the true impact of British colonialism really discussed. It was touched upon a couple of times, mainly like English classes when we're talking about different novels, but it was never discussed in history. And then as an adult, realizing the true extent, because we're told we had an empire, and then it just sort of went away and became a commonwealth, and now we've got what we got, which is, like a couple of islands somewhere and maybe the president of India has to pay attention when the Queen calls. Not even that. It's more Justin Trudeau these days than anything else. But the true horrors don't really get taught. And as an adult, having to learn that on my own, it's just like, I had no idea. But here's the thing: white privilege, because people.
Yeah, I mean,
of
history
color,
is written by the winners, right? So you get to be able to erase the parts that don't make you look as good. And
But
so,
here's the thing: we're not erasing all of it because we keep those military bases named as such. We keep those statues of people who are blatant and proud white supremacists up. Not any longer, because people are now pushing them over, pulling them down, throwing them into ponds and shit, and quite rightly so. And it's not erasing history, as a lot of people say it is. This will always be taught. They'll be in history books. There are fucking Wikipedia articles on these people. They're not gone. It's just not having people of color who have been victims of that colonialization, of that systemic racism, of that white supremacy, or descendants of victims of those white supremacies have to walk to work under the shadow of those statues.
yeah, I mean, I saw this great meme earlier this week that was like, imagine somebody kidnapped your child and then sold them. Where would you like to put up their statue? And it's just like, and it's just, it speaks volumes because it's like, yeah, that's exactly what these people did. There is no reason to honor them in the way that we are honoring them.
And it's people say, oh, and this brings us to the protesting thing. Oh, you can't protest that way. Oh, you can't protest that way. And the reason why they typically ignore the reason why people are protesting is because they are so rightfully angry. I can't even comprehend the level of anger persisting over
And they've
generations
tried
that would
too.
come from that.
And yeah,
And what
exactly. And
is
they've tried. It's not like they haven't tried to do the protests in less disruptive ways, right?
yeah,
In I think what the 1920s, there was hundreds of black people marched down the streets of New York City silently. You know, most recently you have Colin Kaepernick and various other athletes taking a knee during the national anthem as a form of silent protest, a form of silent protest that, by the way, was very much approved by military veterans. Initially, Colin Kaepernick was just sitting on the bench, but then he had a heart-to-heart talk with a military veteran who said, you know what, do the kneel, because that's how we pay respect to the people that have fallen in the military service, and that is a very respectful way for you to protest this injustice. And so that's what he started doing. But obviously, people don't want to listen to that. And so it's, oh, you can't protest that way. That's disrespectful. And then you can't raise a fist. That's disrespectful. You can't wear a T-shirt to a public event that says I can't breathe. That's disrespectful. How dare you do this? And so, well, okay, well, what avenues have been left? What avenues of protest have been left? We've tried it. Black people and people of color have tried it in so many different ways, and it hasn't been listened to. So guess what? Now you're going to listen to the only language that seems to be heard all the time.
And it's, yeah, and this brings me to the next character I want to talk about, Goliath. Probably best known now for Lawrence Fishburne's part in Ant-Man and the Wasp 2, which I loved. Loved Lawrence Fishburne. I loved him in that role. Suck it, DC, because he much prefers Marvel. But in the biggest knowledge I have of Goliath was again in the much maligned Civil War, where Goliath sides with Captain America again because I wonder, I haven't done this, I haven't checked. I wonder if anyone's done accounting for the number of people of color that side with Captain America versus Iron Man. Like, I'm
You
sure
know
there's one or
that?
two.
Yeah, like what are the ratios? That would be interesting. That would be a good thing to look into.
Capers, do the research. But he sides with Captain America because he understands the system of injustice and he believes that, unfortunately, the superhero registration thing is a part of that system of injustice. And sadly, in the course of Civil War, he pays for that conviction with his life. He gets murdered by a clone of Thor that Hank Pym and Tony Stark cooked up and just unleashed upon the superheroes. Lethal force, mind you. They say it was an accident, and Tony Stark is devastated. He's just like, this is not what I wanted to do at all. Yeah, but what did you think was going to happen, unleashing an unstable clone of Thor and pitching it against a giant black man, a literal giant black man, whom they have to bury in a massive grave because he can't shrink down, with a giant hole in his chest? And it's because here's the thing, people of color, the vast majority of them understand this kind of thing. And going back to Luke Cage briefly, again with Civil War, this didn't happen in the main pages of Civil War. This happened in a tie-in comic, I think in the New Avengers. Luke Cage has a heart-to-heart talk with a couple of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents saying, okay, look, what you're doing is wrong. It's bullshit. I will have absolutely zero part of it. Then he sends Jessica Jones, his wife, and their baby away. And then he waits in his apartment. He doesn't do anything, doesn't say anything, just sits very calmly, staring dead ahead. Then midnight approaches, and the Superhero Registration Act comes into effect, and immediately, on the stroke of 12, there's a knock at the door. It's S.H.I.E.L.D. agents come to arrest him. That's what it is. And this brings me to something that really made me fucking angry. The police in America have been, it's more than one case, but they pepper spray kids who happen to be at the protest in the face, an excruciating agony for an adult to endure, much less a child. And people have been taking pictures. One guy took a picture of a police officer doing just that. The police then coordinated a 7-man sting. I say sting, it was really more of an ambush, to arrest that guy because he took the photo.
Yeah, journalists are being brutalized left and right. Kids are being brutalized left and right. They're using tear gas. They're using, all kinds of chemical stuff. They're firing rubber bullets directly at people, which is not how that ordinance is supposed to be used. So
none of it is supposed to be used. Because here's the thing. In war, tear gas is classified as a chemical weapon and is banned by the Geneva Convention.
Exactly. If this was happening, if the U.S. saw the U.S.'s behavior outside of the U.S. would invade the U.S.
Because they have done in the past. When I can't remember where was it, Syria several years back. Chemical weapons were used, and everyone was just like, "That's an outrage. That's indescribable." And yes, the chemical weapons used were much higher quality and much more deadly than tear gas. But at the same time,
it's still an illegal use upon your own civilians. There's no excuse.
It's the hypocrisy, I think, that really gets to me, because a few weeks before this, there were angry conservative people marching up and down all the states of America, brandishing.
There was a dude with a bazooka in a subway. There was a dude ordering Subway sandwiches with a bazooka and his big old American flag tank top. Nobody said shit to that guy. There was people with full military gear screaming, with no mask, no protection, screaming and spitting directly into cops' faces. And the cops are just standing there, no reaction, nothing. Those people got to go home that day. But most recently, I think it was in Philadelphia, there was a girl who climbed over a barricade to give flowers to National Guard troops, and she was arrested. Guess what color her skin was?
Yeah, I don't need to guess. I know. Because, of course. And here's the thing. There is no doubt. If ever there was doubt, and there really wasn't, but if ever there was, there is no doubt now that it's one rule for white people and another rule for people of color. And, God, and you can put that in so many different kind of contexts. It gives so many arguments, but it basically boils down to this. It is not fair. It is not fair. You cannot claim to live in a fair and just society and do this. And, God, it's one of those things that just...
Yeah, man.
I
get it. It's so frustrating and maddening, right? It's just infuriating.
And I'm white. If it's frustrating for me and it doesn't even really affect me, I can only imagine. And because here's the thing, it's what it is it's a system of devaluation. Because of the color you said, you are devalued. You mean less, no matter who you are. And it should be a person's actions and a person's character that determines value, if even we should value human beings at all. And this is where something like Black Panther comes into play. Because this is a black man. This is a black man who is not only is he a superhero, but he is a literal king.
Yeah. I mean, he is one of the biggest badasses in all comics. I mean, the dude is just he's so great. Wakanda forever.
Yeah. The movie helped that popularize that, which is so fantastic and so great. But even in the comics and the various cartoon series that he's been in, I'm not going to pretend like it's all been great representation, but you know what? He has retained the same character. He is a superhero, he is African, he is a king, and he is damn good at what he does, and he's just a good person beyond that.
And the thing I think that also holds so much appeal with Black Panther specifically, as opposed to a lot of other black superheroes, I think the thing that really makes Black Panther so compelling, especially to black audiences and audiences of color, is that he comes from a nation that has been untouched by colonialism and white supremacy. They have managed to completely hold their own. And it represents kind of what you could see, like if those things had never ravaged the continent of Africa, what may have been. And it's such an appealing thing to see an identity, a black identity that was completely crafted by itself and on its own terms. It just sends chills down. It just sends chills down my spine. It's just so.
And then he goes and marries, almost like his female counterpart in a certain way, a strong black woman who was revered as a goddess.
Yes.
She outranks him, technically.
Yes. And
what a power couple.
The power couple. I was a little disappointed that they hadn't managed to incorporate her into the first movie. I'm really hoping that they do. There's rumors.
Beyonce wants the role.
Yeah, there's those rumors. I guess we'll see what happens. As of right now, I think they've been debunked, and it was more towards soundtrack participation, and it's still been debunked. But I mean, I'd be down to see it. I think if you're thinking about just an absolute goddess and queen who represents just a strong, incredible black woman, Beyonce's a pretty great candidate for that. You know, she's a pretty great candidate for that character. I would be okay with seeing it.
I'd be okay with seeing further. There's lots of other actors I think that could make the cut, but that's the thing. I like Storm so much. I think there was a bit of problem in some of the earlier issues with her, because in a lot of early X-Men comics featuring Storm, she was the character that got naked the most for various contrivances.
Exoticism, which is another thing that happens a lot with people of color, and especially with black bodies in general, is the fetishization. Blah, that's a mouthful. Fetishizing them and just the exotic other and all of that exposure. Those are definitely problematic themes that have come up so many times in the representation of black people, particularly when it's done by white people.
But much like Luke Cage, the character evolved beyond that, becoming the leader of the X-Men by taking it away from Cyclops. She's just like, okay, you know what? You and me, we're going to fight. We're going to fight and I'm going to win.
That's it.
She did.
Assert yourself. And that's why I think the fact that she has evolved so much over time, and really they've taken the time to add so much more depth and strength to her character, that is definitely one of the reasons why she's undoubtedly one of Marvel's most enduringly popular female characters.
Yeah, even in the early X-Men cartoon, a dialogue was a bit weird, just like, I am Storm, mistress of the elements. But you know what? She was still cool doing it. And it's something that we needed because a lot of the time when it comes to representation, it's focused on slightly younger characters. I'm not saying Storm is old or anything, but she wasn't a girl; she was a woman, and that's important. It's important to show that strength and later on show that versatility. Because here's the thing: Storm, even though she's worshipped as goddess, she's not a perfect character. She has her moments of arrogance, and she has her moments of doubt. She is famously claustrophobic. Like that's you could argue that's I don't know how you want to argue, but that's a real problem that she has and that she struggles with. And
I mean, it's definitely a humanizing trait, right? For these people who otherwise could be considered gods with their powers, it does humanize them.
beyond that, it's also interesting because almost all the other mutants I hated and feared because of their powers. But Storm, when she was growing up, at first, initially, her powers were exploited by people, but then she managed to get away from that, and her powers were revered, worshipped even. And it's so interesting to see that, especially because the X-Men have always been a metaphor for people fighting against bigotry towards marginalized groups. At first, it was black people during the civil rights movement in the 1960s. That was direct inspiration. Now you could argue it's the LGBTQIA plus movement. Uh, it's a metaphor for any marginalized group, to be perfectly honest. But it's one again going back to the thing. It's one thing to do things through metaphor. It's another thing to do things through literal things. And the X-Men has discussed that, actually. Some of the most, I don't know how well written, but some of the most impactful discussions they've had between the characters have been between a white mutant and a black human. And it's just like, you don't really understand my problem. It's just like, excuse me, I'm black. I understand. And it's like, well, yes, you do, but also you don't. And maybe I don't understand your perspective either. Because here's the thing, bigotry and intolerance, whilst a universal theme, does not mean that one marginalized group has something necessarily in common with another marginalized group.
Right, besides being oppressed. Yeah.
Besides being oppressed, this
For
is going
sure.
back to a big problem. Well, at least a problem as I understand it in the black community a lot of time with gay people, with trans people, and then being
Yeah, there's
excluded or erased, and and that's a problem within the white community as well. Let's be
yeah, I
honest. It's
mean that's
again
a huge
universal
problem in
issue.
a lot of communities. I mean, just from the perspective that I can most realistically provide of being an Indian person, there's so much discrimination and colorism, which is discrimination based on the shade of your color. Um, with just within Asian communities ourselves, because partially because of the colonial influence and stuff. I mean, the skin bleaching industry is still a $1 billion industry in India and in a lot of parts of Asia and Africa. So we're still, there's still a stigma around being dark, and so especially when you see black people within these communities, they tend to disassociate themselves from black people because it's like, oh no, I'm my person, I'm Indian, I'm Asian, I'm this, I'm that, and you're black, and we each have our separate identities, which is true and it's good, but also their struggle historically is also our struggle, and so it is kind of fucked up when Indian people don't show up to these marches or don't post anything in support of Black lives because historically speaking, the advancement of their rights has also helped us. We've piggybacked our rights off of theirs. So their struggle is very much our struggle, even now, even today. And us not saying anything, us being silent, is in itself a form of complicity with this horrible system that we live in.
We all need to work together
Yes.
because A, we can't really do it alone, and B, no one should have to do it alone.
Yeah. No one
And
is free until all of us are free.
exactly, and it is the problem with that is, and that would I think the problem of racism, bigotry, intolerance, and systemic or individual, whatever, would be solved if racism affected everyone equally, but it doesn't. You're absolutely right. None of us are free until we're all free, but someone else not being free doesn't really affect me if it's for the color
Right.
of their skin. But
Right.
that's
And
all
so
the
it's
more
easy
reason
to
why I need to be
dissociate.
active about it.
Yeah, and that's another reason why Asian communities can dissociate again with Black lives is because we have kind of been elevated within, at least within America, to kind of a quote unquote model minority status, which is itself a
Oh yeah.
whole can of worms and something that should be unpacked. But where it's like, oh well, these are the good minorities. They're smart and they work hard and they take care of their things, and so these are the good minorities. No, dude, there's absolutely dumbasses from India. Okay, like there are absolutely very, very, very stupid people across the board everywhere. There is no model minority, and it's kind of a divide and conquer thing. You know what I mean? That lets us feel like we're separated from their struggle, and so like, well, their
And if
struggle
someone
isn't
doesn't
really
live up
affecting
to
me.
those stereotypes, positive or negative, then they feel bad about themselves. And I think again, it's just a question of unity, of teaming up to beat the bad guys. It's a silly way to put it, but it is true. And one of the great examples of that in comics is Cloak and Dagger.
Mm. Oh my God!
Because
Yes, my wife and I actually just started. I just got her into the show because I've seen the first two seasons on Hulu, but she hasn't. But she's very into occult stuff, so that's how I kind of hooked her into it.
I
And so I'm watching it again, and I love that show. It's so good.
it is a good show. I'm not that into it as I am other shows, but it is a good show. But I was more familiar with the comics version, where these two people could not be more different in terms of background, ethnicity, and even personality. And the character of Cloak has really popped up a lot in comics recently. I've been reading a lot of comics when I was like a teenager that just happened to guest feature him. He wasn't even a main character, he just happened to be in it. Mainly because his powers are super duper handy, teleporting people everywhere en masse. But he was really interesting because he was really, even though he was very young, he was this very stoic, eloquent, um, very otherworldly character. He was human and he was just like this guy, but he was, because he was tapped into this extra dimension full of darkness and despair also, it changed him, but he still became a hero and he became this really strong character, both in terms of his convictions and his personality, but also in terms of his powers, all while teaming up with a very skinny, very, very white girl. And all the while, just, he doesn't talk a lot, doesn't say a lot, he doesn't do a lot, he's very still and he's very quiet. He's just there.
Yeah, he
And
sees and listens, and he kind of moves in silence.
yeah, and it's just an interesting character. And it's not that he's silent, he doesn't do anything. He does stuff and he has a
Oh,
personality.
absolutely. But I mean, like he observes, and he's like he's moving in the he is like moving in those shadows a little bit, and he's observing. He's a lot more um I guess, I don't know, pensive about his actions, or
Mm.
stoic, like you said as well. Like he definitely has that thinking element to him, which is really interesting.
And you don't always see that, especially when because he was started. Oh god, the way they started was because they were like two street kids that got shut up with drugs that gave them superpowers.
Of
It was
course.
very 90s. It's very different from Icon, Rocket, and Static, but since then they've evolved, like we say, and could not be more different. But they work well together, and since then they're. I think in the comics they're a couple. I don't know if that's happened in the TV show yet, but
I don't think
it.
yeah, not so far in the TV show. I don't think they, like, every time they touch, they explode. So that
Oh
makes it kind of
my!
inconvenient.
But it's one of the, because here's the thing: there is a lot of bigotry directed towards mixed race couples. Uh, and here's the thing: I've been in relationships with people who aren't white, and I can honestly say I've never experienced that racism. That's never happened to me. If those relationships had continued further, who knows? Maybe it would have happened, maybe it wouldn't. I don't know. So I can't honestly say. I will never claim to say I know what that's like. But there is a lot of discrimination from a lot of different communities with regards to that. And well, the great thing about Cloak and Dagger is, in the comics at least, it doesn't matter to them. They don't care because they just see each other for what they are and they depend on each other. But it's just love. It's just that. And
Which is all it should be. That's, it should, at the end of the day, like, it shouldn't be about any of those other things except for people. But
hmm,
but that's the hand that we've been dealt. So right now we still have to talk about all those matters of identity because that's the world we're dealing with right now. And maybe one day we will have a point where the way they are is just the way everyone is, where it's just about people.
Hmm. And yeah, and it does go back to the writing, and sometimes it's hokey and sometimes it's not. So like another character that you've chosen is Black Lightning.
Right. Yeah,
And
Black Lightning. Who I'm sort of. I will say some of the characters that I chose. I'm not personally crazy familiar with, but Black Lightning stood out to me because he was, for DC, he was their first black superhero back in I think 1977. I want to say.
okay.
So he was like the first one, and very interesting character. But yeah, it was weird because I think DC kind of took a little while to incorporate that, and I have heard some complaints that at least early on, the writing for Black Lightning was also kind of a little bit cringy and a little bit you could spot the problems.
Yeah. But yeah, and that is a problem. But here's the thing: it doesn't help that he's called Black Lightning. Like I'm no meteorologist. I'm pretty
Right.
sure Black Lightning is not a thing. But
Yeah, why can't he just be lightning?
yeah, but
Was
here's the
that
thing:
taken?
I have no idea. I'm not that familiar with Black Lightning either. But then he keeps on growing, it keeps on enduring. And I think that's because there's something important there, culminating in the TV show that I haven't watched since like the first half of the first season, if I'm being honest. But that's because I don't like the way CW does superhero shows. I don't think it's bad, it's just not for me. And it's just, it's one of those things where do you draw the line? Again, where do you draw the line between this guy needs to be defined by his race or this guy should absolutely not be defined by his race? But and there's the thing, no one can draw that line but you. That's up to you. It's your identity. And but this is the problem when it comes to a superhero character that's been going to be written by multiple people over the course of many, many years. So where do you draw the line? And but here's the thing: when you have a character that say is not at all defined by their race, but they just happen to be a person of color, what's that like? Because privilege. I don't know how to dissect this. I don't know how to analyze this. And a good example of that, the other side of the coin, would be Spawn.
Yes.
Because
Yeah, because
I
for
don't
the longest time, they never even actually revealed what ethnicity he was.
and that he very much turned out to be black, and they acknowledged he was black, and that's the way it's always been since. And but it's not a big part of his character. There's many other parts of his character, but that isn't one of them. And I was actually surprised the way they handle that because I am not a fan of early Image. I don't think a lot of people are early Image comics because the writing is it's very much in love with itself. They really like their early Image writing. Oh, that was such great writing from Image. But that wasn't one of the things that I remember of early Spawn, at least. That they did. They just did Spawn. Whether or not you like that character, that's another thing entirely. But here's the thing. Here's the thing. I don't think it's a case of one way or the other. Again, you decide your identity, and if you're a writer and you're writing a character, it's up to you to decide. And there's a whole spectrum of ways you can handle it. Maybe, and I think it's just important is that we have that variety. We have so many people, and so let's talk about the last two characters of yours who could not be more different.
Okay. So which one would you like to start with?
Let's start with Shuri.
I love her. So yeah, so I
She
mean Shuri is Black Panther's little sister, genius inventor, and in the comics and maybe at some point in the movies is also the first woman to hold the mantle of the Black Panther. And yeah, I mean she's just a total badass. And what I love about her too is that there's also I think which again has been something that they've really consciously worked on more and more over the years. But the representation not just of black people, but also of black women specifically, and
Hmm.
other types of black people, beyond just black men.
You still there? Oh, sorry, I thought I lost you
Yes,
for a
sorry.
second there.
Yeah, no, I'm here.
No, I absolutely agree, and because here's the problem: there's so many. Unfortunately, there's so many little Venn diagrams of intolerance that so many people have to deal with. But Shuri, she just I mean, at least in the, I'm not that familiar with her in the comics, but in the movie, absolutely adore her. And she's like, she doesn't give a shit about that. She's just doing what she does. Oh yeah, you want me to invent like a new Black Panther super suit for you? You got it. But I'm also going to film you making a complete twat of yourself, and I'm going to laugh. And then she's going to join the fight, and then she's going to get dusted off screen in Infinity War. Just like, no, the whole Wakandan royal family, really? Oh god, M'Baku at least survived. That's something. But yeah, I love her. But here's the as far as I'm aware, she's a fairly modern character. I don't know when she was first debuted. But
Yeah, I
then
think
you
it
go
was
into
like 90s or something in the 90s run of the comics.
it's a fairly modern, like 30 years or so, depending on how old. But then you've got something like the last character that you've got, Lion Man.
Yeah, Lion Man, which is not even, I'm not even going to pretend I was familiar with him before I started looking into these things. Lion Man is actually the first black superhero from 1947's all Negro Comics, which was a one and only pressing. They only did one issue because I guess maybe back then it was just too soon, and it probably didn't sell very well. But it was like a variety of different stories, all centered around black heroes and black people, and I'm pretty sure probably all done by black people as well. And so yeah, Lion Man was kind of an early inspiration, I think, for Black Panther because he was basically a dude who was tasked with he was a guy who, like, a lot of his costume and a lot of his like symbology and stuff, first of all, was meant to inspire pride in African heritage, and he was tasked with protecting a very valuable resource in Africa. So I have a feeling that maybe Black Panther might have been consciously or subconsciously inspired by that. But
Possibly.
yeah.
I would have to do some more digging to find that out. But here's the thing: this is why I'm so glad you picked this character though, because this is a point I want to make. With people tearing down all these statues of all these white supremacists and all these Confederate people saying, "Oh, you can't do that," not just because it's erasing history, but because it's not their fault. They were a product of their times, which is bullshit. Yes, racism was much more widely accepted and seen as less of a societal ill in those days. The systemic nature of it was still just as prevalent as it is today. But, it wasn't quite as unfashionable back then. But here's the thing: not everyone was racist back then. There were people who absolutely knew in their heart that it was wrong, most notably, black people. And it's there's this so there's this guy in College Humor called Brendan Lee Mulligan, who's a very funny comedian. He does like lots of D&D and stuff on there now with like Roll 20, Dimension 20, whatever. No, yeah, Dimension 20. And he did like this improv thing years ago that was part of some American college, I don't know what. But he was doing a character on stage of an American Civil War ghost. I shared this on Facebook. I'm sure some people friends may have seen it. But an American Civil War ghost who used to be a bounty hunter, capturing runaway black slaves, and then he's just like, "And I am here to say I was wrong, and I'm sorry." And then he goes into like a big speech spiel about how he was objectively racist, he was evil, and there were people in his time who called him out on it. And he goes on to say, most notably, the people who didn't like it were the black people. They visibly did not like being enslaved. And there's because direct quote, and that's the thing. You see, that's the thing. There's this phrase going around specifically with regards to okay, so Gone with the Wind recently announced that it's been taken off HBO Max, and it says this: we're going to take it off temporarily so we can reintroduce it with proper historical context. And that's what they've done with a lot of Tom and Jerry cartoons that feature blackface or horribly racist stereotypical depictions of black people. And they always come back with the same sort of thing, like just before the cartoon. They don't get rid of it. They include them on the DVDs or maybe on syndicated broadcast or whatever, but they always come up with a little warning, just a little warning that says, okay, this following cartoon has some stuff in it that is racist. And the phrase they use is, it was racist then, it's racist now. No matter what society's perspective on it at the time, it was racist.
Yeah, the place where it was coming from was never in question. It might have been more widely accepted, but the place it was coming from was still always intended with a bad intent.
And it's there is no excuse. There's none. Here's the thing. I believe in white privilege. That's a thing. I believe that people need to be aware of their privilege, and I don't think people, and you can disagree with me, and I'm happy to listen to why you disagree with me on this. I don't think white people need to be ashamed of their history, their racist history in particular, because they weren't born. They weren't there. They had nothing to do with it, and they can't help it. But you can absolutely not ignore it, and you can't acknowledge it as anything other than horrible. I mean, you can be ashamed of it. I'm not saying you shouldn't be ashamed of it. I'm just saying that wasn't your fault, but what you do now is. And you, at the very least, bare bones minimum, is acknowledge your privilege, acknowledge the history of the society that gave you that privilege, and if you actually want to do something positive to lessen, if not remove, that systemic racism and that privilege.
Yeah, definitely. I fully agree with you. I mean, it's not about shaming people and making people feel horrible about themselves, but these conversations will be uncomfortable. There will be moments where you do feel bad. Maybe you do feel bad, and like that's okay. And nobody's trying to like just send you down a shame spiral, but acknowledging that these things happened, acknowledging that some of these things happened and were done by your ancestors, maybe not all that long ago, even, and that you are still very much benefiting from the systems that were created back then, are still benefiting you and people who look like you to this day. That acknowledgement is the most critical first step that can be taken towards any kind of meaningful progress or change.
The first step to fixing any problem is acknowledging that there is one. And unfortunately, it's a big part of American culture. It's kind of been drilled into a lot of you, I've noticed, and unwilling to accept that there are problems. That it's almost propaganda-ish. In fact, it is propaganda, the way it's drilled into American children about how America is the greatest country in the world. There is absolutely zero evidence to support that. There is zero evidence to support that the UK is the greatest country in the world. We're shit. This is a shithole place to live, let me tell you.
And I mean, who's defining greatness anyway? You know what I mean? What are these measures of greatness that we're defining them by? Is it education? Is it standard of living? Like, what are the measures of this greatness that allows someone to say, we're definitely the greatest country in the world? Because there's always going to be some things where some people are doing a little bit better and some people are doing a little bit worse.
And on all those things you mentioned, like education or wealth or whatever, there are way more countries that are doing better than America. So if that is how you judge it, that's that you're not doing well. But the best way to determine whether a country is great or not is not where you measure up in terms of education and stuff, or wealth, or even people who are in prison per capita. It's how you treat each other. in both
Yes.
good times and bad.
And specifically how you treat the most vulnerable amongst you, you know? I
Mm,
think too often in America there is a tendency to only look at success and to look at only the successful as a measure of greatness. So it's like, oh, we have the most billionaires in the world, so we're doing really, really well. Okay, I mean, that's cool, I guess, but like you also have horrific poverty happening at the same time. So it can't be that great, can it? You know, for me, I think the measure of a society's greatness is definitely in how much dignity they can afford to the most vulnerable amongst them. How weak is the weakest link in the chain? And
yeah.
definitely in America and in many parts of Europe and many parts of the world, the weakest link in the chain is still pretty damn weak.
And it's just his thing. We talk about superheroes on this show. And I kind of wonder if superheroes were real, or if these protests were happening in the comics. I don't know if they've been referenced or not, or I don't know what the status of that with everything that's happening with COVID-19 and everything. But I kind of wonder which side would they stand on. And I like to think that the Captain America, the Spider-Man, the Iron Man, even the Superman and the Batman and the Wonder Woman that I know would stand on the side of the people who are marching for fairness, for equality, and for removal of bigotry and just consequences for people ignoring people's civil liberties, as opposed to the side that have become increasingly, for no reason whatsoever, that at least no good reason, militarized, who are firing rubber bullets in people's faces, tear gas canisters, who are arresting journalists. This is the very sort of thing that Captain America stands against. A man who proudly and knowingly wears the flag of his country as his costume.
Yeah.
And this is the
Captain
thing that
America
he's,
is the CEO of Antifa, by the way.
yeah, that's what he stands against. It's one of the reasons why he didn't like the way the American government was doing things, which is why he gave up for a while in the comics the persona of Captain America. He's just like, I can't, in good conscience, wear this flag anymore. But since then, he has taken it up again because it's not about what America is. It's not about who leads America. It's about what America could be, and indeed what America should be. In my opinion, America has always set up that they are the land of freedom, of equality, of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and America has not once, not even for one single solitary second, lived up to that promise. But it could do. If one country could do, it would be America. It's not the only country that could do that, but it can do. And there's a lot of people who are scared. They think that their system and that way of life is going to be torn down. It's not going to be torn down. It's going to be fixed. The America you know and love has never existed. And Black Lives Matter is trying to bring that America into being.
Yeah,
You should
yeah,
help them with that.
exactly. So to borrow your metaphor, it's not going to be torn down. It's actually going to be built for the first time ever.
Exactly. This is about creation, not destruction. And you could point to some people saying, oh, they're destroying this or oh, they're destroying that. But as the immortal Fred Rogers once said, in times of crisis, look at the helpers. Look for the helpers. Look at the people who are helping. They far outweigh the people who aren't helping. And I've seen your country come together in protest, in march, and demonstration together to help people. I've seen doctors and nurses under threat and under arrest, threats of arrest and under actual arrest and being pepper sprayed and tear gassed, try and help people. I've seen the most vulnerable be helped by people who are not vulnerable at all, and the reverse. And I've also seen people use increasingly authoritarian and fascistic methods to suppress that. And sadly, I've seen in my own country as well. I was discussing with someone the other day in London at the Cenotaph, one of the most important war memorials for the fallen in all of the UK. There were anti-Black Lives Matter protesters who were treated so fairly by the police, by the way, giving the Nazi salute. this is what we're dealing with. And in this case, instance, it is we, because as much as Black Lives Matter is not about me as a white person, it's not about me. I want to help. I'm trying to contribute, but it's not about me. Fascism is what we're fighting against. Now, when this first started, it was just about racism. Now it's something, unfortunately, far bigger that encompasses racism. Don't get me wrong, because fascism, let's be honest, entirely started by white people, used pretty much exclusively against non-white people, or people that don't fit the sort of the area mold, as it were. And my grandparents had to leave their homes because of fascism. They had to be evacuated so that their parents, and their brothers and sisters wouldn't be killed by Nazi bombs. And now Americans and British people and people all over the world are fighting for, kneeling in solidarity, or standing up against the same people. They're not from the same place, but they're the same kind of people. Be it a bigoted police officer who would happily kneel down on an arrested person's neck, be it an authoritarian arsehole who sits in the White House and thinks that makes him important, be it a legislator who chooses to hold off on an anti-lynching bill, be it an ordinary person just living their life who thinks that, oh no, you shouldn't tear down that statue of the white supremacist. It's all part of the same problem. But you can fix it. It's easy to say, and it is not easy to do, but you can. And because of that, in the show notes, you may have seen them already, we're including some links to the official Black Lives Matter donation page, to the American Civil Liberties Union donation page, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People Legal Defense Fund, the National Bail Relief Fund, as well as some other links. Just anything you can do to help contribute. So what's that?
Yeah, great. Just a bunch of really great causes to support for anybody who wants to get involved with any of this activism. All of these organizations are working very hard towards advancing the cause, and so those are all great charities to go to. If you can safely attend a protest, I encourage everybody to do that if you can do so safely.
So
and
I'm
also
struggling, Capers, because I live in rural Oxfordshire right now, and apparently there was a small rally near not too far where I live, Abingdon, that I didn't get a chance to go to, unfortunately, because I was stuck at work. But if you can, and you can go safely, please go. If you can contribute financially, please do. I know some of you can't. I'm sure some of you can't. But there's more than one way to help. I discussed this with Jillian, previous episode. There's more than one way to help. Be like what Fred Rogers wanted you to be, and look for the helpers, and be one of the helpers, even if it's in a small way, because the only way we're going to do this is together.
Yeah, exactly. And we're also going to include a few links as well if you just want to get more information initially. We're also going to include some links to some other podcasts, both of the nerdy variety and of the serious variety, that are all Black-led podcasts, so that you can support those creators and listen to those voices and those perspectives. And maybe that'll inspire you to get involved, hopefully.
Because this is not going away, but this needs to be done, and I'm not going to stop just at this episode. We may talk about this in greater detail, obviously with a view through the media or whatever, because that is what this show is about. In future, I can't promise what form that would take, but that is something I want to do, because this is not just one conversation and done. This is not the 24 hours news cycle. I'm sure wants to move on by now and it's winding down. No, this is still going, and it needs to keep going, because here's the thing that if there's one phrase that is circulated throughout all this, it's this phrase: protest works. It has started to work. We need to keep going, because eventually they will have no choice but to defund the police and put that resources into more effective measures, limiting the role of the police so that they can do their job better in a limited capacity. It means that legislation will put forward that not just says that people of all ethnicities have civil liberties, but actually backs that up with actual enforceable laws. And it means that politicians will cave and crumble. It means that the media will be forced to acknowledge this side of it. It means everything. It means everything. It can be done. Again, easy to say. But if you feel powerless, if you feel hopeless, if you feel like it's all for naught, you're not alone. You really aren't.
Yes. I mean,
Even if
I
it's
go
just
through those feelings every day. Every day I read news stories that just make me feel infuriated and angered and deeply saddened and also helpless because it's not something that unfortunately I can just snap my fingers and fix as badly as I wish I could. But yeah, we have to just deal with those feelings, understand them, embrace the pain that that brings, because understanding and embracing that pain will help you understand the pain of other people. You know, there's a huge difference. This is something I've been talking to my wife a lot about lately, is there's a huge difference between sympathy and empathy. And I think the world has a lot of sympathy for when bad things happen, but we need to find more empathy. And sympathy is just feeling bad for something unfortunate happening to someone. But empathy is actually feeling that person's pain, actually feeling it as if it was your own pain. And when you do that, you get inspired to do a lot more than what sympathy would inspire.
and and inspiration can come from so many things. It can come from the people you know, it can come from the people you care about, it can come from the people you see on the news fighting the good fight, and it can come from the pages of a comic book. And it has for both of us. But you got to take that inspiration and you got to put it in a positive direction. That's what we're doing here today, and that's what we're going to continue to do. And now it's your turn, and you can do it. We believe in you. And on that note, I think we're going to end the show. Thank you very much, Archit, for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you so much for doing what you're doing. It means so much.
This is the least I can do, and it's not the end, I promise. But if you enjoy the show, Capers, please tell your friends, shout it from the rooftops, and if you haven't already, go back and listen to some of our other super episodes, like all the times we talked about representation in the media and how important it is. You can listen to the show on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, Spotify, or at podcapers.com. If you want to get in touch with us, suggest show topics, or maybe come on the show yourself, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at AP2HYC. Thank you very much to Dan Harris for our logo, the lovely microphone, the Rider Blue 3D glasses, those are mine. And thank you for listening. This has been Podcapers, the official podcast for a place to hang your cape. Remember, Black Lives Matter. Cue the music.